The sun was hanging high in the sky over Los Angeles, shining down with a bright, relentless heat that warmed the pavement and the tops of the parked cars. It was one of those afternoons where the city felt alive, the air buzzing with the sound of traffic and distant conversations. There wasn't a single cloud in the sky, and definitely no sign of bad weather. It was just a normal Tuesday, or at least it seemed that way at first. On a quiet street corner, tucked away between a dry cleaner and a bookstore, sat a small deli. It wasn't a fancy place. It didn't have a flashy sign or a line of customers out the door. It was just a spot where people went to get a good sandwich without spending too much money. Inside, the air smelled like fresh bread, roasted turkey, and coffee beans. Keanu Reeves was standing at the counter, waiting for his order. He wasn't wearing a movie star disguise. There were no dark sunglasses hiding his face, and no bodyguard standing near the entrance. He was dressed simply in a pair of jeans, a t-shirt, and a worn-out leather jacket that had seen better days. To anyone else in the shop, he looked like any other guy in his 50s taking a break from work. He looked tired, but content. He was just staring at the menu on the wall, lost in his own thoughts. The person working behind the counter handed him a paper bag and a cup of hot coffee. Keanu thanked them with a genuine smile, the kind that reaches his eyes. He wasn't acting, he was just being polite. He took his food, turned around, and walked toward the entrance. He pushed open the glass door, the little bell above it jingling softly as he stepped out onto the sidewalk. The moment he stepped outside, the noise of the city got louder. A car honked a few blocks away. A siren wailed in the distance. Keanu took a deep breath of the warm air. He was looking forward to eating his sandwich. Maybe he would find a bench in the park, or maybe he would just walk back to his place. He wasn't in a hurry. He never really seemed to be in a hurry, despite being one of the most famous actors in the world. A few blocks away, a police officer named David was having a very different kind of day. David was not a rookie. He had been on the force for a long time. He had seen a lot of things, but lately the job felt heavier than usual. The city was stressed, and the stress of the city had a way of seeping into the police officers who patrolled the streets. David was standing near his patrol car, wiping sweat from his forehead. The heat was getting to him. He was nearing the end of a very long shift. In fact, he had been working double shifts for 2 weeks straight. His eyes were red and gritty from lack of sleep. His uniform felt tight and uncomfortable. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in hours, and his blood sugar was low. When you are that tired, everything looks a little bit darker. Every shadow looks a little bit like a threat. Just a few minutes before Keanu walked out of the deli, the radio in David's car crackled with an urgent message. Dispatch was talking about a robbery that had just happened a few streets over. The suspect was dangerous. The description was brief. A male wearing a leather jacket seen running toward this area. David felt a jolt of adrenaline. That was the thing about the job. Even when you are exhausted, the adrenaline wakes you up. It pushes your body into action even when your mind is screaming for rest. David got back into his car and drove slowly, scanning the sidewalks. He was looking for anyone matching that description. He knew he had to be careful. He knew he had to be alert. But in the back of his mind, he was just thinking about going home. He was thinking about sitting in a quiet chair and closing his eyes. This mix of exhaustion and adrenaline is a dangerous combination. It makes you see things that aren't there. It makes you react too fast. Meanwhile, Keanu was strolling down the sidewalk. He took a sip of his coffee. It was hot and bitter just the way he liked it. He adjusted the strap of the paper bag on his wrist. He was enjoying the walk. He liked being part of the city, being anonymous in the crowd. He waved at an older woman who was walking her dog. She smiled back, not quite believing it was actually him, but too polite to make a scene. Keanu turned the corner, heading toward the intersection where David was slowly cruising in his patrol car. The sun glinted off the windshield of the car. David squinted against the light. He saw a figure walking on the sidewalk. A man in a leather jacket. David's brain made a connection. It was a split-second decision made by a tired mind. He saw the jacket. He saw the general build. He didn't see the face. He didn't see the coffee cup. He didn't see the paper bag from the deli. He just saw the suspect from the radio call. David slammed on his brakes. The car jerked to a stop. He threw the door open and stepped out onto the street. "Hey, you!" David shouted. His voice sounded rough and cracked. Keanu didn't react immediately. He was listening to a song in his head, or maybe just thinking about a script he had read the day before. He didn't think the shout was directed at him. Why would it be? He was just a guy eating a sandwich. "I said stop," David yelled again. He started running across the sidewalk. By the time Keanu turned around, it was too late to explain. It was too late to say, "I think you have the wrong guy." David was already there. The fear and the tension of the past 2 weeks were pouring out of him. He didn't see a celebrity. He didn't see a peaceful man. He saw a threat. He saw a criminal who might have a weapon. He saw a chance to stop a bad guy. Or maybe he just saw a target for all his frustration.
Keanu opened his mouth to speak, to ask what was wrong, but David didn't give him a chance. The officer lunged forward. He didn't use his taser. He didn't reach for his baton. He used his hands. He grabbed Keanu by the arm with a grip that was incredibly tight, fueled by panic and adrenaline. "Get against the wall, now!" David screamed. "What? I don't—" Keanu started, but his words were cut short. David yanked Keanu forward and spun him around. The force was surprising. Keanu wasn't ready for it. He lost his footing for a second. The paper bag went flying out of his hand. His coffee cup slipped from his fingers and smashed onto the concrete. Splash! The hot liquid exploded outward, splashing onto Keanu's jeans and David's uniform pants. The cup rolled away, spilling the last dregs of coffee onto the dusty pavement. David didn't care about the mess. He pushed Keanu hard against the brick side of the building. The impact knocked the wind out of Keanu. His cheek pressed against the rough bricks. He felt a sharp scrape on his skin. He felt the weight of the officer pinning him there. It was scary. It was disorienting. One minute he was enjoying a walk, and the next minute he was being treated like a criminal. "Hands behind your back! Do it!" David shouted, his face right next to Keanu's ear. He was breathless, panting like he had just run a marathon. He sounded terrified. Keanu didn't fight. He didn't try to push back. He knew that fighting would only make it worse. He slowly moved his hands behind his back. He could feel the heat rising in his own face, not from anger, but from the shock of it all. He could feel the coffee soaping into his sock, making his foot sticky and wet. Around them, the world stopped. People who were walking by froze in their tracks. A woman pushing a stroller stopped and covered her mouth with her hand. A guy on a bike put his foot down and stared. They recognized the man being held against the wall. They knew who he was, and they couldn't believe what they were seeing. "Officer," Keanu said, his voice strained but calm, "please, you're hurting me. There's been a mistake." "Shut up, just shut up," David yelled. He was fumbling with his handcuffs. His hands were shaking so much that he couldn't get them open. The metal clanked loudly against Keanu's wrist. "You think you can run from me? You think you can get away?" Keanu said softly, keeping his eyes closed, trying to stay calm. "I wasn't running. I was just getting lunch." David didn't hear him, or maybe he just didn't want to hear him. He was too deep in the moment. He was trapped in his own fear. The crowd on the sidewalk began to murmur. Phones came out. Cameras started to record. The scene was set. The quiet afternoon had shattered into chaos, all because of a tired cop and a man in a leather jacket who just wanted a sandwich. Nobody knew what would happen next, but everyone knew that nothing about this day was going to be normal anymore. The metal cuffs were cold, but the hands holding them were hot and sweaty. The officer was fumbling, his fingers slipping on the steel bracelets. He was trying to force Keanu's wrists together, but he was shaking so badly that he couldn't get them to click shut. Every time he missed, he let out a frustrated grunt, sounding more like a trapped animal than a man in control. "Stop resisting! Just stop resisting!" the officer yelled again, even though Keanu was doing the exact opposite. Keanu stood perfectly still against the rough brick wall. He could feel the scrape on his cheek throbbing, and the coffee soaking into his shoe was starting to feel cold and sticky. But he didn't try to pull away. He didn't twist his body or kick his legs. He knew that if he moved, the officer might panic even more. He could feel the man's heart beating wildly through the grip on his arm. This wasn't just an arrest. This was a meltdown happening in real time. "I am not resisting," Keanu said, his voice low and steady. He spoke slowly, enunciating every word. "I am standing still. You can check my pockets. There is nothing there." The crowd on the sidewalk had grown bigger. What started as a few people had turned into a dozen or more. They stood in a semicircle, watching the scene with wide eyes. At first, people were confused. They saw a police officer and a man in a jacket, and they assumed the police were doing their job. But then the whispers started. Wait, is that? Oh my God, that looks like him. It is him. That's Keanu Reeves. Someone held up a phone, then another. Suddenly, there were 5 or 6 cameras pointed at them, the black lenses recording every second of the chaos. The energy of the crowd shifted. The confusion turned into suspicion, and then into anger. People didn't like seeing a celebrity tackled over a spilled coffee. But more than that, they didn't like seeing an innocent man handled so roughly. "Hey, get off him!" a young man shouted from the back of the crowd. He stepped forward, his phone raised high. "He didn't do anything." The officer, whose name was David, heard the shout. It made him flinch. He tightened his grip on Keanu's arm, causing the actor to wince slightly. David felt the walls closing in on him. The eyes of the strangers felt like lasers burning into his back. He could hear the clicks of the phone cameras. He knew he was being recorded. In the back of his mind, an alarm bell was ringing, telling him that something was very wrong, but his exhaustion was drowning it out. He just needed to finish the arrest. He needed to get the cuffs on. He needed to prove that he was in control. "Turn around," David screamed, his voice cracking.
Keanu took a small, shallow breath. He decided to try a different approach. He knew that fighting the officer's strength wouldn't work. He had to fight the officer's fear. Very slowly, Keanu turned his head. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the phones. He looked directly into David's eyes. David was staring at Keanu's shoulder, his eyes darting around, refusing to focus. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. His face was pale under the tan, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "Officer," Keanu said softly, "look at me. Please, look at me." David didn't want to look. He was afraid of what he might see. He was afraid of seeing guilt, or anger, or a weapon. But the voice was so calm, so strangely peaceful, that it broke through the noise in his head. David slowly lifted his gaze. He looked into the face of the man he was pinning against the wall. For a second, time seemed to stop. David saw the scrape on the man's cheek. He saw the sadness in his eyes. And then recognition hit him like a bucket of ice water. It wasn't a criminal. It wasn't a suspect. It was the guy from the movies. It was the guy everyone loved. It was Keanu Reeves. David's breath hitched in his throat. His eyes went wide with horror. The realization washed over him, crashing down on top of the adrenaline. He wasn't capturing a dangerous robber. He was assaulting a movie star in the middle of the street for no reason. Keanu saw the change in David's face. He saw the panic turn into terror. "It's okay," Keanu said again, even softer this time. "You're tired, I can see that. But I'm not the guy you're looking for." David's hands let go of Keanu's arms as if they had been burned. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet and nearly falling onto the pavement. He caught himself against the hood of a parked car, his chest heaving up and down. He stared at his own hands, then back at Keanu, who was slowly turning around to face him. Keanu reached up and gently touched his cheek, where it had hit the bricks. His fingers came away with a tiny smudge of red dust, but no serious blood. He looked down at his ruined coffee and the squashed sandwich lying in a puddle on the sidewalk. Then he looked back at the officer. The crowd held its breath. They were waiting for the anger. They were waiting for the yelling. They wanted to see the famous actor tear into the cop who had just embarrassed him. But Keanu didn't yell. He didn't clench his fists. He just stood there, looking at the broken man in front of him. "I think you dropped these," Keanu said quietly, gesturing to the handcuffs that David was still clutching in a trembling grip. David looked at the cuffs, then up at Keanu. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He felt dizzy. The street began to spin. The shouts of the crowd started to fade into a buzzing noise. He looked around and saw all the phones pointing at him. He saw the anger on the people's faces. He knew his career was probably over.
He knew he had just made a terrible mistake in front of the whole world. I, David stammered. His voice was weak, nothing like the shouting from before. I thought, the description, they said a leather jacket. I know, Keanu said. He took a small step forward, but the crowd gasped, thinking he might attack. Keanu stopped and held up his hands to show he meant no harm. It's okay. It was a mistake, a bad one, but we are okay now. Nobody got hurt. Just then, a siren wailed nearby, getting louder quickly. Another patrol car screeched around the corner, its lights flashing red and blue. It pulled up to the curb, blocking the street. 2 other officers jumped out, hands on their belts, looking ready for a fight. They saw David leaning against the car, pale and shaking. They saw Keanu standing calmly, wiping coffee off his jacket. And they saw the angry mob with their cameras. "Officer down? Suspect secured?" one of the new officers shouted as he ran over. David didn't answer. He just slid down the hood of the car until he was sitting on the bumper, putting his head in his hands. He couldn't bear to look. The shame was too heavy. It felt like a physical weight on his shoulders, heavier than any gear he had ever worn. Keanu looked at the new officers. "No one is down," he said, his voice carrying over the noise. "And there is no suspect, just a misunderstanding. Your officer here, he just had a long day." The 2 new officers looked at each other, completely confused. They looked at the video evidence being recorded by the civilians, then back at Keanu. They slowly relaxed their stance, realizing that the famous actor wasn't a threat, and that their colleague was the one who had lost control. The crowd, however, wasn't as forgiving. "You should arrest him," one woman screamed, pointing at David. "Look what he did!" Keanu turned to the crowd. He raised a hand, asking for silence. It was amazing how quickly they listened. "Please," he said, looking at the woman. "He didn't mean it. Let's not make this worse than it already is." The mood shifted again. The anger subsided, replaced by a strange curiosity. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. The man who played the toughest heroes on screen was showing more mercy in real life than anyone thought possible. David sat on the bumper of the car, listening to the actor defend him, and he felt tears prick the corners of his eyes. He didn't understand it. He didn't understand why the victim was being the protector. But for the first time all day, the noise in his head finally stopped. He took a deep breath, and for a second, he just focused on the sound of Keanu's voice, guiding everyone away from the edge of disaster.
New officers tried to take control of the situation, but it was like trying to herd cats. The crowd was still murmuring, phones still held high, recording every second of the embarrassing scene. The red and blue lights from the patrol car washed over the street, making everything look strange and dramatic. It felt like a movie set, except the emotions were too raw to be scripted. A sergeant arrived a few minutes later. He parked his car and walked over with a heavy step. He looked at the mess on the sidewalk, the spilled coffee, the squash sandwich, and most importantly, the famous actor standing calmly in the middle of it. Then he looked at David, who was still sitting on the bumper of the car, staring at the ground as if he wished it would open up and swallow him whole. The sergeant's face turned hard. He didn't need to ask what happened. The cameras explained it all. One of his officers had lost control in public and had tackled a civilian, a very famous civilian. "Officer David," the sergeant barked, "stand up and get in the car, now." David flinched at the sound of his name. He slowly pushed himself up. His legs felt weak like jelly. He couldn't look the sergeant in the eye. He couldn't look at Keanu. He felt like he was moving through a nightmare. He reached for the door handle of the patrol car, but the sergeant stopped him. "Not that one," the sergeant said sharply. He pointed to the back seat of his own vehicle. "You're done for the day. Give me your badge and your gun." The crowd went quiet. This was the part they hadn't expected to see. It was rare to see a police officer stripped of his power right on the street. David's hand shook violently as he unclipped his badge from his chest. He held the shiny piece of metal for a moment, looking at it. It represented years of work, years of trying to do the right thing. Now it felt like a piece of trash. He placed it in the sergeant's open palm. Then, with trembling fingers, he undid his belt and took off his holster. He handed the gun over. It was a heavy, humiliating moment. David felt small. He felt like the entire world was judging him, and they were right to do it. He had messed up. He had messed up badly. Once David was in the back seat of the sergeant's car with the window closed, the sergeant turned his attention to Keanu. His demeanor changed instantly. The hardness melted away, replaced by a look of deep concern and apology. He walked over to Keanu, shaking his head. "Mr. Reeves," the sergeant said, his voice full of regret, "I cannot tell you how sorry I am for this. This is not how we do things. This is unacceptable." Keanu brushed some dust off his sleeve. He glanced at the car where David was sitting. David had his head in his hands again. "I'm okay," Keanu said quietly. "My shoulder is a little sore, and I lost my lunch, but I'm okay." An ambulance had pulled up, and the paramedics were waiting with a stretcher just in case. Keanu waved him off. He didn't want to make a scene by getting on a stretcher. He just wanted to go home. "We need to take a statement, and we need to make sure you are checked out by the doctors. You have the right to press charges: assault, battery, false imprisonment. Given the video evidence, it's an open and shut case. We will support you 100%. The sergeant waited. This was the most important part. If Keanu wanted to destroy David's career and possibly send him to jail, all he had to do was say yes. The police department would throw David under the bus to save face. The public would cheer. It was the logical thing to do. Keanu looked at the sergeant. He looked at the paramedics. Then he looked at the crowd. A young girl was holding a phone, her eyes wide with worry. She looked scared, not just from the police, but from the anger in the air. Keanu didn't like that. He didn't like that his city felt so angry. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Keanu asked the sergeant, stepping a few feet away so the microphones on the phones wouldn't catch everything. The sergeant followed him. "Of course, sir. Anything." "Look," Keanu said, keeping his voice low. "That man in the car, he didn't do this because he's a bad guy. He did it because he's scared. He's exhausted. I could feel it in his hands. He's vibrating with stress. If I press charges, he loses everything: his pension, his job, his life. Is that really justice for a mistake?" The sergeant was surprised. He had dealt with hundreds of complaints. People usually wanted blood. They wanted revenge. He had never met anyone who wanted to understand the officer who hurt him. "Sir, he used excessive force. We have protocols. He has to face consequences. Internal Affairs will investigate. He is suspended immediately. That is non-negotiable. But if you press charges criminally, yes, it ends his career." "I don't want to be the one to end it," Keanu said firmly. "I won't press charges today. I'll leave it to your department to handle the discipline. Just make sure he gets help, okay? Don't just fire him and forget him. He needs a break, not a funeral." The sergeant nodded slowly. He looked at Keanu with a new kind of respect. "I can promise you we will look into his welfare, but we have to suspend him. The public won't stand for anything less." "I understand," Keanu said. "Just do what you have to do." Keanu walked back to the center of the sidewalk. The crowd leaned in, waiting for the announcement. Someone shouted, "Are you suing him?" Keanu shook his head. "No," he said simply. "It was just a misunderstanding. I'm fine. Let's all go home and have a good day."
There was a moment of silence. The people looked at each other, disappointed that there wouldn't be a scandal, but also relieved that things were calming down. Slowly, they started to disperse. The magic was over. The show was done. Keanu looked down at the mess. His sandwich was ruined. He sighed. He was hungry, and his shoulder was starting to stiffen up. He felt a dull ache where he had hit the wall. One of the officers offered to drive him home, but Keanu declined. He needed to walk. He needed to clear his head. He walked away from the flashing lights. He turned the corner, leaving the chaos behind him. The street grew quiet again. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows. Keanu walked for a long time, just letting his feet move on the pavement. Usually, after something like that, he would feel angry. He would feel violated. And yes, there was a part of him that was annoyed. His arm hurt. His favorite jacket was scuffed. But the main feeling in his chest wasn't anger. It was sadness. He couldn't stop thinking about David's eyes. When he looked at the officer, he didn't see a monster. He saw a man who had reached his limit. Keanu knew what it felt like to be under pressure. He knew what it felt like to lose people you love, to carry a heavy load. But he had never felt the kind of pressure David must be under. The pressure of the city, of the badge, of the danger. "Why were you so scared?" Keanu whispered to himself. He knew that walking away and letting the police handle it wasn't enough. The system would chew David up and spit him out. They would suspend him, investigate him, and leave him to rot. Keanu had a feeling that there was more to the story than just a tired cop making a mistake. There was a reason why a veteran officer would snap like that over a leather jacket. Keanu stopped walking. He was standing in front of a small park. He sat down on a bench and watched some birds pecking at the grass. He took out his phone. He didn't check social media. He didn't look at the news. He just sat there thinking. He realized that the incident wasn't over for him. It had just started. He had walked away from the scene, but he couldn't walk away from the responsibility he felt. He had seen a human being breaking, and he had the power to help fix it. It wasn't about being a hero. It wasn't about the cameras. It was just about doing the right thing when nobody was watching. He decided then and there that he wasn't going to let David disappear into the system. He was going to find out why that officer was shaking so hard, and if he could do something about it, he would. Keanu stood up, wincing slightly at the pain in his shoulder. He took a deep breath of the cooling evening air and started walking toward his home. He had some phone calls to make. He didn't know exactly how he was going to help yet, but he knew he had to try. The attack on the sidewalk was shocking, but what Keanu was planning to do next was going to be even more surprising. The sun had completely set by the time Keanu walked through the front entrance of his home. The house was quiet, filled with the kind of silence that only happens when you are alone in a big space. He didn't turn on many lights. He just flipped a switch in the hallway, casting a soft yellow glow over the floor. He was tired, a deep kind of tired that went past his muscles and settled into his bones. He walked into the kitchen and opened the freezer. He took out an ice pack, wrapped it in the thin towel, and pressed it against his shoulder. The cold was sharp at first, making him wince, but then it turned into a dull numbness that felt good. He stood there for a long time, leaning against the cold granite counter, looking out the window at the dark city below. Lights were flickering on in tall buildings. Cars were moving like tiny beetles on the streets. Everyone was going somewhere. Everyone had a story. But Keanu's mind was stuck on the sidewalk from earlier that afternoon. He kept seeing the officer's face. He saw the way the man's hands shook. He saw the pure terror in his eyes when he realized who he had grabbed. Most people would be angry. Most people would be calling a lawyer right now, looking for a payout. But Keanu didn't feel anger. He felt a heavy sadness. He felt like there was a puzzle piece missing, and he needed to find it to see the full picture. He put the ice pack down and picked up his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found a name. It was a private investigator he had used a long time ago for a security matter. It wasn't a police matter, it was just a quiet favor. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Hello?" "Hey, it's Keanu. I'm sorry to call so late." "Keanu, I saw the news. Are you all right? That looked rough." "I'm okay. Sore, but okay. Look, I need a favor. I don't want to sue. I don't want a scandal. I just need to know about the officer, David. I need to know why he snapped." There was a pause on the line. The investigator was surprised. Usually, people wanted dirt to destroy someone. Keanu wanted dirt to understand him. "I can look into it," the man said slowly, "but official records might be sealed because of the internal investigation. It might take a day or so." "That's fine," Keanu said. "Just find out what's going on in his life. Is he in debt? Is he sick? Is there a reason he was working double shifts?" "I'll get back to you," the investigator promised. Keanu hung up the phone and sat on his couch. The house was still quiet. He thought about the look on David's face when the sergeant took his badge. It looked like David was dying inside. It wasn't the look of a man who just lost a job. It was the look of a man who had lost his lifeline.
The next morning, Keanu woke up early. His shoulder was stiff and bruised, a dark purple mark spreading across his skin. He took a hot shower to loosen it up, letting the water run over his back. He drank coffee and watched the sunrise, waiting for the phone to ring. Around 10 o'clock, the investigator called back. "Keanu?" The voice on the other end was serious. "I found what you were looking for, and it's pretty heavy." "Tell me," Keanu said, sitting up straighter. "Officer David," the investigator began. "He's been on the force for 18 years, spotless record, not a single complaint. Until recently, he was one of their best guys. But about 6 months ago, his life fell apart. His daughter, she's 8 years old, she was diagnosed with a very rare immune disorder. It's aggressive." Keanu closed his eyes. He felt a punch in his gut. Is she going to be okay?" Keanu asked. "It's touch and go," the investigator continued. "The treatment she needs is experimental. It's not covered fully by his insurance. The bills are astronomical. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars a month. David sold his house. He sold his car. He moved his family into a small apartment just to pay for the first round of meds. But it wasn't enough." Keanu remained silent, picturing the little girl he had never met. "That's why he was working so much," the investigator added. "He was taking every extra shift he could get. Night patrols, traffic duty, security gigs. He was barely sleeping. He was running on caffeine and desperation. The radio call yesterday, he was already at his breaking point. When he saw your jacket, his brain just snapped. He wasn't seeing a civilian. He was seeing a threat to his survival, because if he lost his job, his daughter dies." Keanu let out a long breath. It all made sense now. The aggression wasn't malice, it was fear, pure, terrifying fear. David wasn't a bad cop, he was a drowning father. "Thank you," Keanu said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for finding this. Are you going to press charges now? Knowing this, it might help him in court, but the department still might fire him." "No," Keanu said. "I'm not pressing charges, but I'm going to do something else." He hung up the phone. He stood up and walked to his desk. He pulled out his checkbook. He looked at the balance. He had more money than he could ever spend. He had enough to buy 10 houses, 100 cars. He had a fortune sitting in a bank doing nothing. And across town, there was a man who had lost everything, and a little girl who was fighting for her life, all because of a number on a piece of paper. It didn't seem fair. It didn't seem right. Keanu had always believed that money was just energy, and it should be used to help people. He had donated to hospitals before, to cancer research, to children's charities. But this was different. This was personal. This was a direct connection. He had looked the man in the eye. He had felt the man's shaking hands. He picked up a pen. For a moment, he hesitated. It wasn't about buying forgiveness. If he wrote this check, people would say he was trying to buy his way out of a scandal. The press would have a field day. They would say he was paying off a victim. But Keanu knew the truth. He wasn't paying David off. He was catching him. He thought about the 8-year-old girl. She didn't care about movie stars or police scandals. She just wanted to feel better. She wanted her dad to not be scared. David was suspended now. The income had stopped. The bills would keep coming. They would lose the apartment. They would lose everything. Keanu dipped the pen in the ink. He wrote out a number. It was a big number. It was enough to cover the treatment. It was enough to cover the apartment for a year. It was enough to let David sleep at night. He ripped the check out of the book. He held it in his hand. It was just a piece of paper, but it felt heavy. He folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't just mail it. That felt too cold. He had to go there. He had to look David in the eye again.
not as an enemy, but as a human being. He walked to the mirror and fixed his collar. His shoulders still hurt, but he didn't care about the pain anymore. He grabbed his leather jacket, the same one that had caused all the trouble, and put it on. He looked at himself. He didn't look like a billionaire. He looked like a guy who was going to have a difficult conversation. Keanu walked out of his house, got into his car, and started the engine. The drive to the police station wasn't long, but it felt like the longest drive of his life. He rehearsed what he was going to say in his head. He didn't want a speech. He didn't want a thank you. He just wanted to fix it. He realized that the incident on the sidewalk wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a connection between two very different men. One man had everything, but had lost so much in the past. The other man had nothing, but was fighting desperately to keep what he loved. Today, Keanu was going to bridge that gap. He was going to turn a moment of violence into a lifetime of peace. And as he drove through the city streets, he felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in a long time. The next morning, the air outside the police station was thick with tension. News vans were parked along the curb, their satellite dishes pointed towards the sky like metal flowers. Reporters held microphones, and cameramen balanced on their toes, waiting for something to happen. They were expecting a scandal. They were hoping for anger. They wanted to see the famous actor march into the station with a team of lawyers and demand justice. The headlines were already written in their minds. Star versus police. Assault on the sidewalk. City divided.
But when Keanu's car pulled up, the mood shifted slightly. He stepped out of the vehicle wearing the same casual clothes as the day before. Simple jeans, a t-shirt, and that worn-out leather jacket. He didn't have a lawyer with him. He didn't have an entourage. He was alone. He ignored the shouted questions from the reporters. He didn't wave or smile. He just walked toward the glass entrance of the station with a quiet sense of purpose. Inside, the station was busy, the way police stations always are. Phones were ringing, typists were clacking away at keyboards, and officers in uniforms were walking back and forth with stacks of paperwork. When Keanu walked through the metal detectors, the room went silent for a beat. The officers recognized him immediately, but no one stared for too long. The sergeant from the day before hurried over to meet him. "Mr. Reeves," the sergeant said, looking surprised and a little anxious. "I didn't think you would actually come down here. We were sending a detective to your house to take your formal statement." "I know," Keanu said calmly, "but I wanted to come in person. Is he here?" The sergeant hesitated. He looked around the busy room, then lowered his voice. "He is. He's in a waiting room. He's supposed to be clearing out his locker. Internal affairs is tearing him apart in there. He's not doing good, Keanu. He's a broken man." "Can I see him?" Keanu asked. The sergeant sighed. He looked at Keanu's face, searching for any sign of anger or revenge. He saw none. "I suppose so. Technically, you are the victim. You have the right. But please, don't make a scene. He has enough on his plate." "I won't make a scene," Keanu promised. The sergeant led him down a long, narrow hallway. They passed heavy doors and walls painted a dull, institutional beige. They stopped in front of a door that had a small window in it. The sergeant opened it and stepped back, letting Keanu go in alone. Inside, the room was small and impersonal. There was a metal table bolted to the floor and a couple of plastic chairs. David was sitting in one of them. He was still wearing his uniform pants and a t-shirt, having taken off his uniform shirt and badge. His elbows were on his knees and his head was in his hands. He looked smaller than he had the day before. The fire and the panic were gone. Now he just looked like a shell of a person. When the door clicked shut, David looked up. His eyes were red and swollen. When he saw Keanu standing there, he flinched. He tried to stand up, but his legs were too weak, so he just slumped back in his chair. I'm sorry," David whispered. His voice was cracked and dry. "I am so sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me.
I know my career is over. I just want to apologize to your face." Keanu didn't say anything right away. He walked over to the metal table and pulled out the plastic chair opposite. He sat down slowly, his shoulder still aching a little. He looked at David for a long moment. He saw the dark circles under his eyes. He saw the wedding ring on his finger that was twisting around nervously. "I know about your daughter," Keanu said softly. David froze. His mouth opened slightly. The color drained from his face even more. "You... what?" "I know she is sick. I know about the treatments. I know why you were working so hard. I know why you were so tired." David put his face back in his hands. A sob tore out of his chest, raw and ugly. I tried so hard to be a good cop. I tried to do everything right. But the bills, they just kept coming. I haven't slept in weeks. When I saw you, my brain it broke. I thought I was catching the guy who could pay for her medicine. Isn't that insane? I attacked an innocent man because I was desperate." "You didn't attack me," Keanu said, leaning forward. "You attacked a problem. You just got the target wrong." David looked up, tears streaming down his face. "They're going to fire me, and then I won't have insurance, and then she won't make it. I failed her. I failed everyone." Keanu reached into the pocket of his leather jacket. He pulled out a plain white envelope. He placed it gently on the metal table and slid it across to David. "What is this?" David asked, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. "Open it," Keanu said. David's hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the envelope. He fumbled with the flap and finally pulled out the piece of paper inside. It was a check. David looked at the numbers. He looked at the zeros. He blinked, thinking he was hallucinating. He looked back at Keanu, his eyes wide with disbelief. This is too much," David stammered. "I can't take this. Why would you do this? I hurt you." "You didn't hurt me," Keanu said, shaking his head. "You scared me, sure. My shoulder hurts a bit. But this money, this isn't for me. This is for her. It should cover the treatments, and there's enough there to take some time off, to sleep, to be with her." David stared at the check. It was more money than he had made in 10 years. It was a lifeline. It was a miracle. "Why?" he asked again, his voice barely a whisper. "Everyone hates me. The city hates me. I saw the comments online. I'm a monster."
"You're not a monster," Keanu said firmly. "You're a father who is scared for his child. We've all been there. We've all been in a dark place where we don't know which way is up. Yesterday, you were in that dark place. Today, I'm just turning on the light." David broke down again. This time, it wasn't a sob of despair, but a cry of relief. He clutched the check to his chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Thank you," he choked out. "I will never forget this. As long as I live, I will never forget this." Keanu stood up. He placed a hand on David's shoulder for a brief second. "Just take care of her. That's all that matters now. Don't worry about the job right now. Just fix your family." Keanu turned and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the handle. "And David, get some sleep." Then he walked out. Keanu walked back through the busy station. The sergeant was waiting by the front desk. He looked at Keanu, then down the hallway toward the room where the sounds of quiet weeping could still be heard. The sergeant seemed to understand what had happened. He didn't ask for details. He just nodded slowly, a look of deep respect on his face. When Keanu pushed open the glass doors and stepped back outside into the bright sunlight, the roar of the crowd hit him like a physical wave. The reporters surged forward, shouting questions. "Did you press charges? Is he going to jail? Are you suing the city?" Keanu stopped on the top step of the station. He looked at the sea of faces. He didn't have a propound statement. He didn't have a publicist whispering in his ear. He just spoke from his heart. "There will be no charges," Keanu said clearly. The crowd went silent instantly. Cameras flashed rapidly. Officer David made a mistake. A bad one. but he is a good man who is going through a terrible time. We spoke, and we understand each other. I just want everyone to go home and be kind to their neighbors. You never know what battle they are fighting." With that, he turned, walked down the steps, and got into his car. The reporters were stunned. They looked at each other, not sure what to write. The story they came for had vanished. In its place was something much rarer, a story of forgiveness. The headlines that night were different. They weren't about police brutality or celebrity ego. They were about grace. Inside the station, David sat in the plastic chair, holding the check. For the first time in months, the weight on his chest was gone. He pulled out his phone and dialed his wife. He needed to tell her that their daughter was going to be okay. He needed to tell her that a stranger had given them back their life. As Keanu drove away, merging into the flow of traffic, he didn't feel like a hero. He just felt like a man who had done the right thing. The city rushed by him, full of noise and problems, but for a moment, everything felt a little bit lighter. The attack had been shocking, yes, but what happened the next day? That was the real surprise. It was a reminder that even in a hard world, kindness is the most powerful weapon we have.